Hello, everyone. You're all very welcome to this week's Inspiring Ideas at Trinity webinar. My name is Megan Donaldson, and I'm the Global Alumni Relations Officer here at Trinity Development and Alumni. Today, we're very delighted to welcome Trinity alumna Lindsay Walsh, a G20 Young Global Changer, Professor Anna Davies of the Department of Geography, and Dr. Marcus Collier of the Department of Botany, who will share their thoughts on how the current health crisis may impact how we address the challenges facing our climate, particularly in terms of urban life. Now, before we start, I'd like to quickly go over a few technical items. If you're joining us on Zoom and you'd like to view in full screen, you can do so using the button in the top right corner. If you need to adjust the audio setting, you can do so using the button in the bottom left corner. And if you need to leave the session for any reason, you can do so using the button in the bottom right corner. We would very much like you to ask questions of our panelists, and you can do so by submitting your questions via the Q&A button there at the bottom of the screen. And our speakers will respond to these at the end of the session. If you experience any technical issues during the webinar, or if you need to drop off for any reason, we will be recording it, and the recording will be made live later today. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube Live, if you need to mute or unmute the video, you can do so using the small speaker button circled there in red. To share the webinar, you can click on Share. To subscribe to our YouTube channel, you can click the red button that says Subscribe. And of course, as I said, we'd love to hear from you, so please do share your thoughts and comments in the comment box. The panel discussion will last about 35-40 minutes, and there'll be time afterwards for questions from the audience. So we should take just about under an hour and wrap up around 2 p.m. Irish time. So now to introduce our speakers. Anna Davies is Professor of Geography, Environment and Society at Trinity, where she directs the Environmental Governance Research Group and is a member of the Trinity Centre for Future Studies. Widely published in the fields of geography, environmental policy and sustainability, Anna is a member of the Royal Irish Academy, a governing board member of the International Science Council, and a board member of the European Roundtable on Sustainable Consumption and Production. She is also a founding member of Future Earth's Knowledge Action Network on Systems of Sustainable Consumption and Production, and is the inaugural chair of Future Earth Ireland. She is a director of the Rediscovery Centre in Dublin, Ireland's National Centre for the Circular Economy, and a creative space connecting people, ideas, and resources for greener living in Ireland. And she advises the Irish government as a member of Ireland's National Climate Change Advisory Council. Marcus Collier is an assistant professor in urban nature-based innovation in the School of Natural Sciences here at Trinity, where he is also director of research. He is currently the coordinator of the Horizon 2020 Nature-Based Solutions Project, Connecting Nature. Marcus's research interests focus on the complex and fascinating interface between social and ecological systems, especially scaling out nature-based solutions in an urbanizing world and the potential of innovation and nature-based enterprises. And last, but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce you to our MC for this afternoon, Lindsay Walsh. Lindsay is a G20 Young Global Changer and was named a climate change influencer by the Irish Times. She holds a BSc in Natural Sciences and is presently completing her MSc in Development Practice here at Trinity, where her master's research is focusing on the possibility of a just transition in Ireland's beef sector. Lindsay has received international awards for her research, writing, and climate advocacy work. She's an Antashka Climate Ambassador and was named an IMF Young Leader for her writing on climate change and inequality. Lindsay is currently working with the capacity building team in the United Nations Climate Secretariat. So over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Megan, for the lovely introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I know the Zoom fatigue has well and truly settled in at this point, so it's really appreciated. So I suppose to kick off our discussion, our cities are being used in a completely different manner than before the pandemic, where people used to congregate in busy shopping areas and business districts in the city centre. We are now seeing these spaces being deserted and people instead flocking to green and blue spaces. Anna, I'll come to you first. How do you think the pandemic has changed how we view and use our open and green spaces in cities?
Thank you. It's a really important question, now more so than ever, I guess, particularly when we think about the fact that 95% of people with COVID have been living in urban areas. And so it's increasingly important to consider these things. So yeah, as you say, early on in the pandemic, we had media coverage of deserted cities, highlighting the apparent returns of city to wildlife freed from the constraints of human interference. Many of these turned out to be slightly myths or highlighting activities that were already ongoing before the pandemic at some level. But the message, I think, was clear. People were astounded that non-human nature might be able to rapidly recolonize our concrete in our absence. But beyond these media moments, the early lockdown in Ireland and its spatially restricted regulations for outdoor exercise gave us an opportunity to rediscover our local places. More people began to grow their own food, seed sales soared, applications for allotments and community gardens increased. So busy were our parks really that designated times for vulnerable people had to be established to avoid overcrowding and allow for social distancing. And what happened under the pandemic really gave empirical backing to the multifaceted values that urban open space has been identified by scientists for decades, whether it's physical health through exercise, mental health, reducing stress, reducing blood pressure, connecting to non-human nature and spaces to safely interact with others. I mean, fundamentally, we are human and social beings after all, and have spent 99% of our existence as a species living closely alongside nature. And it's really only last 1% of our time on Earth that we've really begun to experience nature deficit disorder. While some of us were really lucky enough to have green open spaces nearby, others were not so lucky. And I think the unevenness in access is significant to be rectified, not only because the virus is likely to be with us for some time, but also because it brings additional benefits, increasing biodiversity and contributing to change resilience in our cities. So we really need to think about democratizing provision of open space within easy reach as a kind of human right, really. So I say our use of open spaces certainly changed, and these experiences have been widely valued, as indicated by numerous rapid surveys of practices under COVID. And these values really need to be enshrined now in development plans and enacted. The green initiatives need to be heard by developers and landowners. You might ask, why aren't they already? Because a lot of these things have been under discussion for many years. But it's clear that, you know, having open green spaces has costs too. You need to acquire land, you need to manage and maintain it, making it sustainable, devising rules for appropriate use. But I would say that the return on investment for the well-being of people and the resilience of our urban areas is well worth it, even if it's hard to financialise.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up the topic of inequality as well, because I think while like the pandemic gave us a renewed appreciation for these green spaces, it also showed the inequality of access to those green spaces. And I think it also kind of hammered home how before we might have viewed these spaces as a nicety, now we're really viewing them as a necessity. And as you say, I hope the county councils and the Irish government really takes heed and builds more of these and increases access and funding to these, and not only in the tourist beauty spots where they already are, but also in these areas that need them the most and already don't have access to them. I think it's an interesting point that health crises in the past have actually a history of leading to improved access to these public spaces. I mean, Central Park in New York was built after the second cholera outbreak in the 1800s. So I think that there is like a real chance to really seize on this and help improve the access, and it has to be managed in a just fashion, as you have so rightly outlined. Yeah. And Marcus, I'll come to you now. How do you think the pandemic has changed how we relate to these spaces?
Well, I completely agree with that. That's very much in what I was going to bring up, what you just said there in terms of the history of making cities is replete with councils and local authorities reacting to such things as epidemics or pandemics in the city, and the way some cities are in fact designed relates to issues like that. So most definitely, and I think one of the things that was from my point of view was that there was a lot of complaining about, you know, there's not enough space in our parks. But what as Anna was saying, what that was really underscoring and providing evidence for is that there's not enough parks, and more importantly, they're not within convenient distance to those that need them the most. And within that, then we started seeing a lot of from my point of view, was really interesting to see a lot of people making observations about nature and what that meant to them near their houses. And some of them, for the first time, are noticing things and hearing birdsong. You could see that a lot. Whereas Anna mentioned, they were there all along. It's just that we only now begin to notice them. So what that for me is saying that whilst we see a societal demand for more conveniently distanced to our residential areas, and especially in areas where there's poverty, parks and green spaces and open spaces, that we're also demanding for them to be designed and used in a more multi-functional way. So less of the grassy plain and more of the diverse habitat and more opportunities for different communities and different ages to have an equal share and an equal usage of these parks. So we see our open spaces being reevaluated, and I'm not just seeing this in Ireland, we're seeing this through my project, through all the different cities we work with in the project. It's pretty much standard in practically in all the cities that we have talked to, that the demand for open space and different user and flexibility within that open space. So it used to be that, for example, we couldn't have tables and chairs or whatever. Now it makes more sense to have pop-up cafes, pop-up playgrounds, and different types of activities. So we see that that there's a huge demand for this, and we see hopefully cities beginning to respond to that because, of course, they're hopefully listening to what people are asking from them.
Absolutely. The quality spaces are crucial in reducing these inequalities, and also in the fight against climate change, obviously, in both mitigating and adapting to, which we'll come to more later, but also in reducing the spread and mortality rates of COVID-19. So they're incredibly important. I think their importance has only been really emphasized throughout this pandemic. And so to continue on from that previous question, the pandemic has changed how many of us go about our daily lives, with much of us now working from home, obviously. And this has had many knock-on impacts for our cities, such as pedestrianization of areas and construction of cycle lanes. Anna, what changes do you hope remain, and how do you see some of these relating to climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd love to see the maintenance and expansion of infrastructures for active travel that you mentioned, so the cycling and the walking, which has really seen a boom under the pandemic. I'd like to see Irish cities follow the lead provided by Amsterdam, Bristol, Melbourne, and explore the usefulness of new models for thinking about city development, such as Kate Raworth's donut economics. I don't know how familiar people are with this, but essentially it takes the physical form of a donut and seeks to identify spaces. So the inner ring sets out the minimum that we need to lead a good life, and it's been developed in relation to Sustainable Development Goals. The outer ring of the donut is really like where the sprinkles go, if you like, represents the ecological ceiling drawn by Earth system scientists. And in between the two rings is the Goldilocks zone, where the good stuff is, where everyone's needs are met and the planet's needs are met. So the central premise of these kind of new models is that the goal of economic activity should be about meeting the core needs of all, but within the means of the planet. And so this donut, if you like, is a device to show what this means in practice. Doesn't bring us the answers. There are still very difficult decisions to be made. But it's a new way of looking at the problems. And I think we really need to empower local authorities who are closest to the people to respond to their specific local circumstances. They're going to need the rules, the tools, the skills and understandings to embed and enact plans to prioritise things like the circular economy, climate resilience and intolerance to inequalities. And I think one way of helping local authorities in Ireland to do that is to connect with other local authorities internationally. For example, Cork is a member of the Healthy Cities Network, but it's the only member in Ireland. I really think we need to start resetting decision making. I came across a really fascinating project recently, although it's been going for more than 10 years in the UK, called the Long Time Project. And it's developed a set of tools that can help decision makers adopt this longer term horizon. Because these changes won't be easy without a change in mindset, and also that change needs to happen beyond government. I mean, we did some research funded by the Environmental Protection Agency here a few years ago called Consensus, which looked at consumption, environment and sustainability. And we used a process called participatory backcasting. So we took a point in the future, 2050, and collectively created a vision of what might be a desirable city in the future, 2050. And then we worked backwards from that to see what needed to be put in place in the short, medium and long term to allow us to achieve those desired goals.
Wow, that's really, really fascinating. And it's so true that there's not going to be a one size fits all approach we just need more cycle lanes and that these decisions really need to be made in a truly participatory fashion where citizens are involved, as you so rightly say. Marcus, I'll come to you now. How do you hope the future to evolve, and what changes do you hope remain?
Well, I would like to see. I mean, I think this was an interesting last couple of months for everybody, and I think what I'd like to see is the joining up of some of these ideas. So we see cycle lanes hither and yon peppered throughout various cities, with the exception of some of the ones in Netherlands and other cities. Very few of them are actually joining up together. They tend to just end. And then we're back to a situation where what coronavirus has really shown us, especially here in Dublin, is that how much of our space in our city is designed and managed for a relative small number of city users, to the exclusion of other city users, road users and path users and so on. And so what we're hoping for is that whilst people who would notice that we're becoming aware that this is what a sustainable city might be like. It would have low noise, it would have low dust, it would have, the air quality would be good. People are probably thinking this is wonderful, but how do we join that up in terms of the policies we put in place? Is one thing saying that we have to reduce traffic, but people still have to get in and out of the cities to live, work, and play, and to do the various things that they do in cities. So what it really has done also for me, just looking at some of the other cities in the various projects that I'm involved in, it freed up a lot of the cities to implement their policies, sustainability policies, that they were possibly having difficulties doing in the past. They were finding it difficult to argue a case for more cycle lanes or widening footpaths or pedestrianizing others, because of the vested interests and the lobby groups saying that it would be detrimental. Whereas evidence is showing that it's not necessarily detrimental to urban economics, as Anna was mentioning earlier on, that you can have, to follow the donut analogy, you can have your cake and eat it in cities. But it has also, I think, allowed city councils to reevaluate how they go about their consultation processes, how they go about implementing things. It's been said that it's a sort of a proof of concept idea that these are the types of cities that are emerging from coronavirus, and let's see what happens. So essentially, rather than focusing on a specific groups of people in cities, and it goes back to the equity and equality we mentioned earlier on, and designing our cities and constructing our thoroughfares for that. We should be actually looking at the whole picture and looking at how all city users, or possibly people who are maybe disenfranchised to use the city, they're maybe not feel that they're comfortable coming into the city because of sizes of footpaths and so on. And finally, I think it also refocused attention on our businesses and showed them that a sustainable city doesn't necessarily mean an empty city.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Marcus. So many solutions being put forward in tackling climate change in our cities are nature-based solutions, which are interventions that utilize ecosystems and their properties to address societal challenges while preserving the natural environment. So an example would be the living walls on our Trinity Business School, which act as a refuge for wildlife and biodiversity in our own city centre here in Dublin. So Marcus, I'll have to come to you first here, as your research is focused on nature-based solutions. How do you think these can be used to tackle issues such as COVID-19 and climate change?
Well, I think nature-based solutions will be a phrase that not many people will be as familiar with. It's starting to become more used. So just to recap, it's essentially a way of regreening our cities whilst deriving other benefits for wider society. So for example, a living roof will do a job for you. It'll retain the heat in a building or insulate the building below it, that is, and it will possibly even attenuate rainwater and prevent the drains from flooding. And when we get episodic rainfall, all due to the climate changes that are happening. And so these are the ecosystem services that nature-based solutions can provide to build resilience to build climate resilience in cities. But a living roof can also support biodiversity, but also provide a rest area, a relaxation area for a busy working environment. And they can also be, agriculturally productive. And these are the co-benefits that nature-based solutions are which are as much social as they are ecological. And so this is where nature-based solutions can greatly boost our resilience to issues such as coronavirus. So the nature-based solutions are not going to solve problems like pandemics, but they can be designed to mitigate a lot of the negative effects. So, for example, in the parks that we were mentioning earlier on, they can be redesigned to tackle climate problems such as flooding or heat island and so on, but also designed to provide respite in terms of psychological issues and isolation issues that we noticed the pandemic revealed about our cities. So it's almost like a gift that keeps on giving, and because over time they become more mature and they generate more co-benefits for people. In our project, we've been looking at in Connecting Nature, that is, and in previous projects as well, we've been working with cities to develop nature-based solutions and spin these things out and scale them out, and provide business models, for example, for financing them, and looking at how do we measure their impact and their social return on the investment. In the last, I'd say, 8 to 10 weeks, there's been a marked change with cities where they've become much more embracing of nature-based solutions. They were already part of our project anyway, so they were embracing it in somewhat, but they really started to notice, oh, these are the types of things that we're able to do with nature-based solutions. And so coronavirus has certainly opened up not only the discussion for us, but it's actually allowed us to try out these things and to show people that they can work. At the same time, people are actually demanding them. So it's pushing an open door as we see it. So certainly, whilst the nature-based solution will be able to tackle climate-related issues, it's also able to tackle social issues as well. And what we're seeing in some of the projects at the moment is that there's a greater focus now on health and well-being than there would have been in the past. And so we're really delighted to see this happening, and we're hoping that nature and regreening cities can be a step towards that, certainly in Ireland, but also in the other cities we work in.
Absolutely. That's great to hear that there's increased support and interest for it. I can definitely see it within even my own friend groups that people are really, really pushing for this regreening of cities. So definitely that's great to hear. And Anna, to come to you now. How might we enroll more people in climate action in cities through things such as nature-based solutions?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And just to kind of follow up from what Marcus was saying, in some research that I'm involved with, European Research Council, a project called Share City, which is looking at the role of ICT and how it enables different forms of food sharing in the city, right from community gardens and growing, right through to redistribution and disposal, community composting at the other. And we've co-designed with food sharing initiatives a tool, a sustainability impact assessment tool, which is available from our website. It's downloadable, open access, to enable these kinds of organizations, often grassroots innovators, like they've really emerged from the grassroots, to support those innovators to be able to demonstrate the worth that they create, and not just financially, but through ecosystem services, as Marco was saying, and also in terms of social benefits. So I think what's important to recognize is there are lots of nature-based activities which are already in the city, which are largely invisible because they don't match or mimic the mainstream business economy that we're so familiar with. So I think it's about recognizing that nature-based interventions in the city are not new, and that we can learn from pre-existing experience here and people who are very much at the coalface of these kinds of activities. One example where it's been used, grassroots innovation in South Central LA by a guy called Ron Finley, who's also known as the renegade gardener of South Central, because he was fed up that more people in his area were killed by drive-throughs of fast food takeaways than drive-bys. And he set up a curbside vegetable garden outside his house. on the kind of public land between the footpath and the road. The city said he should remove it. The city regulations didn't permit any obstructions in these spaces. So, but a movement began behind that. More and more people started converting the spaces outside their houses into vegetable gardens. And eventually the council backed down and now permits food to be grown in this way, because these areas were food deserts where fresh food was rarely available to the populations. So Ron Finlay was seeking nourishment, empowerment, education, one garden at a time, if you like. And I think here in Ireland, there are already long waiting lists for allotments and gardens. So the effort is also here. It just needs to be fulfilled, and we need to enroll all these volunteers, entrepreneurs, innovators who are already active in this space to really learn with them. I think another example, which maybe speaks more to the question that you asked me, which was around how do we enroll more people in these kinds of activities. A really fantastic project is rolling out in the UK at the minute called Slow Ways, and it's devised by a guy called Dan Raven Ellison, who's a self-defined guerrilla geographer and creative explorer. And the goal of Slow Ways is to create a network of walking routes that connect all of Great Britain's towns, cities, as well as thousands of villages. So using existing footpaths, people will be able to use slow ways to walk between neighbouring settlements. And it shows a real participatory citizen science approach. He already found that during lockdown, 700 volunteers from across the country collaborated to produce the first draft of the Slow Ways map. So it's been an incredible effort. Identifying more than 7,000 routes, stretching over 100,000 kilometres. And I think we already know that walking can improve health and well-being, and as well as helping to tackle climate and ecological emergencies, saving people money, improving the environment and bringing joy to people's lives. And this has been backed up recently by the work of Trinity Professor Shane O'Mara in his book in Praise of Walking. So I think there are already examples where we can take inspiration from how people have been involved in these kind of nature-based interventions, which also help in terms of climate resilience. But I think at a kind of fundamental level, there are a number of things that need to be in place before people will get involved in climate action or more involved. They need information. They need information about the climate challenge, of course, but they also need information about how, where and when they can participate in the development of plans and their enactment. There needs to be trust between citizens and decision makers that their contributions will be considered if their precious time is being donated. Participation opportunities need to be opened out beyond the usual suspects and devise new ways of going out to meet people rather than expecting people to come to us, perhaps. We need to go to the spaces and sites that people are active on, whether it's TikTok or the local GAA club. I think that we need to be a bit more creative about how we engage with people. And participation needs to become the norm. It's a process, and there's a danger of once-off events that are not followed up, leading to disenchantment amongst participants who will then think twice about participating again. So I think there's a suite of things that we need to consider.
Absolutely. I think just even from the number of grassroots movements that you mentioned there is such a will for like people to go out and get involved in these activities. And perhaps it is a major problem is this connectivity, which Marcus mentioned earlier, and that you need to bring all these actors together to truly enact that change and empower people to help create the cities they want, really. So at the beginning of the pandemic, some people were saying that COVID-19 would be an equalizer of sorts, as it seemed to spread to every country and target without discrimination. This is an idea which has obviously since been debunked, as COVID-19 has been shown to actually amplify existing inequalities. And I suppose this is an area in which climate change and COVID are so similar in that they're crises of inequality as well as health and environmental crises. Those who are most vulnerable to the crisis are poor minority groups, and they're also less likely to cope with the impacts of these crises. I mean, this is true on both the global scale, in climate change, with the wealthy world being responsible for the vast majority of emissions, yet low and middle income countries will be the most impacted by climate change. And the same goes for COVID-19, with those from poorer countries with less access to water and sanitation facilities, more cramped living conditions, and with economies that are less likely to rebound in the aftermath. I mean, the World Bank has warned that the virus could push between 40 and 60 million people into extreme poverty by 2021. And then even on a local scale within wealthy countries, even such as Ireland, the pandemic has hit those who are least able to adapt to the crisis the hardest. And it's exposed inequalities within our society. As those with less money are more likely to live in these cramped conditions, such as direct provision or the meat factories, as we've seen. And the same can be said for climate change. I mean, as those with money will be able to move away from areas vulnerable to flooding, this land will become more and more expensive on like highland, and those with less money will be less able to live in safe environments. And it's not only in health where this inequality is stark, it's in education, as those with access to good internet or quiet living conditions can continue their education remotely, whereas those without these privileges will obviously fall further behind. And it's also in genders. Women are more likely to take up care duties and working at home, as we know, and they also make up the bulk of frontline health workers. So as just some of these facts have shown, crises obviously serve to exacerbate inequalities across all metrics. And if unchecked, climate change and this pandemic will further widen these gaps between the haves and the have-nots. So Anna, I'll come to you first now. How can we tackle climate change and COVID-19 while also trying to reduce social inequality?
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? I mean,
it is. Yeah.
If only I had the answer. But I mean, I think that it's a challenge. There's no getting away from the fact that it's not going to be easy, and there is no silver bullet response. And you know, we have seen the debacle in the UK about the A-level results and the algorithm. There is no technical fix. It will be significantly important in our responses, but we must not abdicate kind of responsibility to the notion that technology is in some way kind of objective or without potentially negative implications. And I think you're right, COVID has made achieving just transition to a decarbonised future even more challenging, because households perhaps vulnerable to fuel poverty or domestic energy deprivation have become even more precarious, perhaps due to reduced income, lack of access to infrastructure, rising energy needs if we have to stay home and have lights and heat. I mean, in the summer, not necessarily so problematic here in Ireland at least, but certainly as we move into the winter, and the virus will be with us here this winter for sure, it does raise challenges there. But what I would say is certainly our responses to COVID must not hinder our pathway to decarbonisation. So we must ensure that where we're building back as a country, we're investing those areas which have a long-term future for our sustainability, for the sustainability of Ireland and the globe more broadly. And this will require further serious, proper interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research, improved science policy communication and interaction. But a hopeful point, I'm always a bit of a despairing optimist, but a hopeful point is that there is some evidence that green projects create more jobs, deliver higher short-term returns on investment spend, and lead to increased long-term cost savings. So it's about investing now in these areas which will provide long-term dividends, both for climate and for the protection of health and safety of people. It's about ensuring equitable access to services, a long-term and just response to climate change. So improvements to infrastructure and the places we live in, and investment in that values the contribution of all of these aspects that we've been talking about today, particularly kind of nature-based solutions and these ecological social interactions. Absolutely. Yeah, these crises just only expose the inequalities that are already present in the systems. They don't really create them. Crises that have been there for a long, long time. And Marcus, just to go along from what Anna was saying, how can we ensure that in addressing COVID-19, we don't fall behind on tackling climate change?
Well, this is the key thing, and just to continue on from what Anna was discussing there, we hear about the European Green Deal, and originally it was mooted as a way of stimulating the green economy to do exactly what you were saying, to have high return on investment and create jobs and better jobs, and also at the same time protect our sustainable development and our sustainable direction. But recently we see the Green Deal being talking about regreening and re-stimulating the economy after the coronavirus issues. So in many ways, it's nice to see that Europe is actually looking at this from a way of saying, well, we can respond to the pandemic and stimulate the economy using a sustainable paradigm, which is actually quite good. We did some research in the last couple of weeks with our cities, and we're just one of 11 other nature-based solution projects that are funded by the European Commission. And we asked them to do the same thing. So they talked to their cities and asked them that very question: how prepared are you, and do you feel that climate change preparations and climate change adjustments will be beneficial or will be contrary to preparing and reacting to coronavirus? And in many cases, all of them are saying that they're having a terribly difficult time, and some more than others. But we found that those cities that had, when I say found, we're still asking, they're still discussing with them, but those cities that reported that they felt better prepared for, or they had been preparing quite a long time for dealing with the impact of climate change, such as increasing green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and developing and supporting the green economy, they are saying that they feel that they're better prepared for tackling issues like the coronavirus pandemic, where there's some significant social impact. So they're saying basically that by preparing for being climate resilient, they're just becoming more resilient to other things. At least that's what we're hearing at the moment. It's still very anecdotal, and it's still we're still in the middle of it. Essentially, some cities are still at the beginning of it, or at the stage we were at several weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So it's still too early, I think, to start throwing the confetti in the air and saying this is the magic bullet to solve all our problems. It's not going to be like this. As you were saying, that it revealed a lot more issues that were already there and will always be there. Things like age, we see the impact on people over 70 and over 80. We see the impact on youth, and in terms of, we won't mention exam results at school because it's probably still close to people's hearts, but we realize that we have to do things completely differently from all elements of our education, all elements of our society, because it's not just to do with coronavirus. It's to do with we need to upgrade ourselves. We need to get to the 2.0 situation in society where we're starting to be, and to actually be more to transition to be more resilient, and that's one direction. We're not going to go backwards from there. Mm-hmm. So what I'm pretty excited about, it's cautiously excited about, is that cities are saying to us that some of these actions, these nature-based, or these we're looking at, for example, establishing a nature-based entrepreneurship, a nature-based enterprise platform in the project, and we're seeing that these are companies that the people are coming to them to invest in them, whereas in the past they wouldn't have been. And so it could be that this is an ideal opportunity to realize a lot of the heretofore more difficult climate resilience discussions and constructions and retrofitting and so on. And it's a good opportunity for us to say, well, actually, if we do this, we also are helping to protect ourselves, or to become more socially resilient when, and not if, but when a similar situation arrives in the future. Just to say that lockdown situations happen across the world in many cities, regardless, for example, with forest fires or heat waves and so on. So it's not just coronavirus that keeps people in their houses, it's other climate related issues. So they are inherently connected in some way. And at least what we're doing now in the urban area is we're spotting ways that we could have our cake and eat it. As I said, we could try and do by doing one thing, we're also targeting the other. And interestingly, because there's been a more desire to invest in coronavirus or pandemic resilience, that will free up a lot of investment capital that will help us to tackle some of the other natural capital issues in our society.
Absolutely, yes. And you led me very nicely into my last question, actually. And I think we'll have to run very quickly in order to be able to answer some of the questions from the Q&A. So if you could just, perhaps 1 minute each, I'll come to you first, Anna. What are the key lessons learned from the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic that you would like, that we could take forward into our handling of the climate?
Yeah, well, and so there are 3 points really that I think have made really clear. And the first is how important it is to communicate the link between science and policy making. And also we've been given privy to how people respond to and engage with public decisions and this uncertain emerging science in relation to COVID, but also in terms of impacts in relation to climate change. I think it's important, it's demonstrated how important it is to be transparent about how decisions are made. I think there's a lot of work still to be done about unpacking the underlying assumptions and values which underpin political decisions, which are ultimately about the allocation of value. So I think thinking about that would be really important. One final thing I'd like to say is in relation to uneven power geometry that's there. We often talk about stakeholders if they're all equal, and I think it's what the COVID has really shown is that there are some really big, powerful actors out there, whether it's tech, platform economies, pharma, big pharma, and I'd really like to see these massive powers with huge financial backing really stepping up and playing their role in this this process, both in terms of COVID response and in return with respect to climate change.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Marcus, what are key lessons learned?
Yeah, I was going to mention communication as well and listening. This is one of the things that it's showing us that we need to listen more and listen to those unheard voices or those the unusual suspects and the people who don't normally feel or are able to be contributors or to be part of the decision-making process. And then just to underscore what we said at the start there about adapting our green spaces for a wider user group, and in other words, for all users on an equal basis, and to make them more diverse in themselves, to make them more multifunctional and more utilitarian, and at the same time they'd be quite nice places to visit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And just from listening to both of you, and you both spoke so wonderfully, thank you so much. I picked up 3 things, I suppose, of lessons learned. And the first, I suppose, is preparedness. I mean, we were warned that there'd be a global pandemic long before there was one, just as we've known about the climate crisis since the 1970s, many scientists anyway. And I hope that in listening to experts and research and facts during the COVID crisis, I hope that spills over into how we manage the climate crisis also. Secondly, I think COVID-19 has shown how important leadership is. I mean, of course, we need these grassroots movements, but we also need top-down leadership as well, as these are systemic problems, as you all have so rightly pointed out. And I suppose lastly, a lesson to take forward is collaboration, which is completely what you're saying on the communication. Climate change and COVID are global crises, and they won't be managed effectively without international cooperation. So thank you so much, Marcus and Anna, for a really, really enlightening discussion. And you both are working on so many wonderful projects that I think are going to get mentioned at the end. So now we will move on to the Q&A. So here I have one question from Michael Maluli, and he asks, in regreening our cities, might there be any negative effects? So I suppose I will come to Marcus first, if you'd like to answer that.
Yes, I mean, we can't do anything without upsetting some other format. I mean, it's too complex an issue just to say it's a simple answer. Yes, there are examples of where in regreening we could, for example, we could be reintroducing species or possible dangerous species into cities, or making it easier for them to come into. And then on the social side, by upgrading parks or by increasing the green areas, you are creating the possibility of gentrification in those areas where people, you might have gone into a particular area which is, let's say, a low number of parks and is social housing, or a lesser developed, poorer area, built a lovely park, and then that increases the rents and so on, because people want to desire to live near there. And so the people who can't really afford the higher rents have to move back out further from the city into the situation. So there are potential negative effects from regreening cities. And what Anna mentioned earlier about the collaboration and consultation and proper engagement with not just stakeholders, but also all communities of interest, that has the potential for at least tackling that on a fundamental level. But also we need strong policies that say that just when we put a park in, or when we upgrade a park, that it doesn't push people out, the very people actually who need it the most. People who need a place to exercise, people who have issues with diet, have issues with their weight and so on, really need parks nearby. And having it close by is a magnet. It actually brings it out in them. It's more likely that if they have to drive to the park to go for a walk, or to get a bus, it doesn't always work that way. So yes, agree completely. There is a potential negative effects, but there are possible ways around that.
Yeah, and just to move on to your point there, I remember reading something interesting recently that Paris is implementing the idea of the 15-minute city. I don't know if you've heard of this. Yeah, but where all your basic amenities would be within 15 minutes of your residential area, which I think is a fascinating idea. And I don't know, Anna, would you like to add anything to Marcus?
Yeah, I mean, I think that notion is the recent incarnation of it, but I mean, the concept of a livable city has been around for decades also. We get different names for these things, trying to give them a push up the political agenda, I think. And it makes intuitive sense, doesn't it, that why should you be traveling 2 hours across the city to access essential services, or to get fresh fruit and vegetables, for example, or to go for a walk in a park? It just doesn't make any sense. So it's an intuitively pragmatic kind of solution, but of course it's very difficult to retrofit on already existing cities, and that's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wanted to respond also to the previous question, because I mentioned about the costs of the edible parks or community gardens, and the fact, why doesn't this already exist if it has so many benefits? And it does require governance and maintenance. They don't just operate on themselves. They need that for both the benefit of the biodiversity, but also in terms of safe and appropriate use of these spaces. But I would say that the investment in that is exactly where investment should go. So if we're talking about a just transition, we're talking about greening the economy, then isn't it better to create many more jobs in park stewardship and management and governance than it is to create road maintenance or other investment? I mean, it's not that our cities have no costs already in relation to how they're managed and governed. It's about redirecting some of those flows away from those which are high carbon intensity to those which provide multiple benefits, including potentially climate resilience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so many people look to New Zealand as an example of like creating jobs in conservation and land management. And they like act as though we couldn't really do that in Ireland, where the reality is we could. It's just we need the governance and the political will behind it. So hopefully we'll see more of that in the future. I have another question here from Leonard Abrahamson, and he asks, despite a renewed interest in regreening our cities, is it not more likely that, with money in short supply for the government with the pandemic crisis, the emphasis will be on pumping vast amounts into the bottomless pit of the health service, leaving nature up to individuals and communities? So would you like to go first on this, Anna?
Yeah, I don't mind. I think that, the reality is that money is going to be short. I would hope that there will be more stimulus around investments for positive low carbon developments, for sure. I think it would be fair to say that already a lot of these kind of urban interventions, nature-based solutions, are being driven anyway by communities and individuals, often with lots of volunteering time. This is not new. And people, I think, having experienced the kind of connections with non-human nature through parks and gardens and through being locked down and what that has meant to them, may stimulate a greater willingness for participating in these kinds of developments. And in some ways, it's about, you mentioned leadership, and I think that's really important. And leadership is not all about money. It's about providing leadership to structure the way in which we distribute our resources, which are financial and otherwise. Time is precious too. I think this is it's one of the problems around the financialization of everyday life that we live in now. Everything is essentially boiled down to money. But for a lot of the initiatives that I've been working with through Share City, many of the barriers are not financial. They have the people, they have the time. It's about finding I mentioned it earlier, the rules and the tools. They need the supports, the skills and understandings. They just need these other things to align and combine to assist them in what they're doing. So it's not that we can do without the money. The money is necessary for investment, but it's not the only thing that's needed. And we do have some of the other building blocks.
Absolutely. And you spoke about just transition earlier, and I think it's important to recognize that a just transition is not only about the monetary aspect, it's also about issues of recognition of the values of the communities undergoing a transition, and having them participate and decide on what their future is going to look like. So I'm really glad you brought that up too. And
Yeah,
And
I
Marcus
could mention about the health issue is
yeah.
yeah, it is. It sounds like a cynical comment, but actually that's probably what's going to happen. But the thing about it is that our job as researchers is to make the case and prove it. You know, so we in many cases. Part of that financial investment in health could also be in parks, and so you can in other countries there are in other cities they have invested in parks and in areas like we had, for example, in Ireland, the Shleanis launch that idea of where you get a better heart, for your heart, you'd walk a certain route around towns around Ireland. That was in the 1990s, that was an initiative. So that was invested in by the health providers and so on. So there is a case there. And I see on the chat, Tig McIntyre, University of Limerick, who's starting a similar project on nature-based solutions and health and well-being. In order to make this case, to show the investors, to show the people in the health services that it's one thing, you know, building buildings and putting things in place, and that's all very necessary. But there's preventative measures that are necessary. We need to be not just curing things, but we also need to be stamping out before it gets started. And in many ways, that's a better form of investment in some particular, for certain diseases, certainly. Like diabetes and heart disease, it's better to prevent than to try and cure, because the costs are exponentially bigger at the other end of the scale. So we have to make the case and provide the data and provide the scientific backing to show that your investment is actually better. We need to know what your your return on investment is actually good, because this is your investment, and then the co-benefits that go with that we haven't measured yet, we also need to look at too. So there is a scenario there that we could use health investment in greening areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And you both have shown the connections between these green spaces, climate action, and tackling the health crisis. So, and that's absolutely the role of research, is to make the case for this, for a better future, basically. So I think we have time for one more question. So this one is for James Orr, and he asks, do you think people will be more likely to use cars rather than public transport to commute to work because of the pandemic? And would this increase transport-related emissions and slow down climate change mitigation? So just to briefly put in this myself, I think this is where the cycle lanes and the walk to work schemes fall down, is in rural areas. I think where people, they don't have an option, they need to drive to work, and that can't be ignored. And I think working from home is a great incentive, kind of decentralizing. People may not have to go to work as much and use their cars to go to work, but basically we need better investment in our green public transport. So Marcus, Anna, I'll come to you first, Marcus. Yeah.
I just think you saw what happened when they started releasing people from lockdown. The traffic just went up like you wouldn't believe, because people were too scared to get on public transport because it's safer in their car. They were isolating in their car, as they always were. So we're literally thrown back to square one. Yeah. And actually, it was pushing for people to move to cars. So, you know, obviously now that we've become more familiar with it, and as we get more used to this scenario, and we're going to do it it'll be another year at least, we're in this scenario, we're going to start to realize that, you know, using public transport with proper protections is actually a better way to go about your business. Using cycle lanes is the best way to go about your business, unless, as I found out yesterday, you're crossing the Lewis line and you end up on the floor because the railway lines when they're wet are not the best things. But the same, you know, there are things, there are kinks and chinks to be kicked out of our system, as there always will be, especially in urban areas. But I totally take the point in less urbanized areas, and where people peri-urban, the car is still the biggest attractiveness to people, and public transport is not is not necessarily the answer for people, especially when they're crossing or going to another part of the city or going through it. So we need to be really clever on how we design. I think we need to embrace technology an awful lot more too.
Yeah. Follow on from Marcus there, that in relation to work with the Climate Change Advisory Council have been doing, particularly focusing on transport and electrification. Obviously that needs to be renewable electricity ultimately, but the role of electric vehicles in this space as well, particularly, as Marcus said, in rural areas where public transport, and that there isn't even that density of population to support an efficient public transport system. Just anecdotally from my experience, I'm seeing a lot more electric bikes around. So, these kind of, and scooters and things like that for the halfway house, where, it's longer than what is perhaps feasible for walking, but, is long enough for these kinds of vehicles to work within their range comfortably. That's not an issue. So, there are ways, and there's a big challenge to meet electric vehicle targets around climate change in Ireland generally. Should help push towards that, and should help investments in the infrastructures which are badly needed to support that shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, as Marcus rightly pointed out, it's so difficult when, I think last night in the press conference, the public health guidance for Ireland is to not take public transport if you can. So, it's very, it's very difficult. So I think that is all the time we have for our discussion. We've got 5 minutes left. And I think Megan, I'm going to hand back over to Megan to wrap us up. But I'd just like to say thank you so much to everybody for tuning in, and especially to Marcus and Anna for their really, really amazing insights into this discussion. I think we could have gone on for a lot longer than we did, I'm sure. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to add my thanks to Lindsay's, definitely. And if you could have kept going for a while longer, I could have kept listening for a while longer. That was absolutely brilliant and so much to think about. And a huge thank you to the three of you for today's discussion. It's been another hugely thought-provoking webinar and given us a lot to reflect and act on, hopefully, as we come out of lockdown, whether it's in the next few months or, as Marcus says, another year from now. But as we reacquaint ourselves with our surroundings and the importance of not just our health, but the health of our climate and our planet. I'd also like to take a minute to just thank our team at Trinity Development and Alumni who have been working very hard behind the scenes to make this webinar possible. And of course, a huge thanks to all of you who are listening and engaging so enthusiastically. We really appreciate the questions. We had a lot of great ones come through, and I'm just sorry we weren't able to get to them all. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, we do have a few websites there listed for you to visit if you'd like to follow up on anything. The first is the Connecting Nature initiative, which you heard about from Marcus, which he's hugely involved with. And their motto is bringing cities to life, bringing life into cities. And I think that sums it up. And they're focusing on nature-based projects in urban settings. And as I said, Marcus is very involved with this initiative, and they have some fascinating projects underway. You can also follow them on Twitter at Connecting NBS. There's also a link there for the Share City project, which Anna mentioned. The project is looking at the potential of food sharing economies to transform cities onto more sustainable pathways, and it's definitely well worth a look. And they're also on Twitter, and they use the handle at ShareCityIRE. And as Anna says, well, they have a free open access book on urban food sharing for those who are interested, and that's that library.oapen.org that you see there at the bottom. And finally, if you have any questions or comments regarding the webinar series, or any other questions you'd like to ask us here in the alumni office, please do email us at alumni@tcd.ie. And just to mark your calendars, our next webinar will be on Wednesday, the 2nd of September. We'll focus on the theme of career development in a COVID-19 world, and we'll explore how COVID-19 is changing the workplace and the impact of this on career progression and transition. Our speakers on the 2nd will include Orla Bannon, who's the Director of Careers here at Trinity, Siobhan O'Shea, who's Client Services Director at CPL and Chair of the Dublin Regional Skills Forum, and Claire McGee, who's the Head of Education and Innovation Policy at IBEC. The registration link will be sent out by email next week, so keep an eye on your inboxes. And in the meantime, thank you once again for joining us, and I hope you all stay safe.